Welcome back. We are going to cover now the Case Manager Training Module 4, Sections 15 through 19. Module 4 will cover Section 15 that entails provider training requirements. Module 17 is positive behavior supports. Section 18 is restrictive interventions. Section 19 is psychoactive medication standards.
And just a note, Section 16 is reserved for further rulemaking, so we will not be going over Section 16.
Thank you, Julie. Sorry, we're having some technical difficulties, so we are good now. All right, so the first part of Section 15 is going to cover provider training standards. Providers are required to make sure employees are qualified to deliver waiver services prior to working with participants. Employees shall be trained by staff that have already received training before they can work alone with any participants. Providers have to keep documentation that employees have been trained and must include the following information: when the training was completed, who conducted the training, and how the employee showed their understanding of the material. The provider must ensure that the staff conducting the training has expertise in the topic area and keep documentation to verify the expertise. This would include education, training, and any experience they have. Section 15 outlines trainings for provider and staff, and this section does not include all training areas that are required by other Medicaid rules or sections within Chapter 45. For example, positive behavior support plans or restrictive interventions. The rule states that providers and their employees must receive the appropriate training before working with any participants. It also says that providers and staff should work with and be trained by another staff that has already received the training before he or she works alone with that participant. For those participants that may be transitioning to a new provider, the division highly recommends that the new provider staff work with the outgoing provider staff to learn more about the participant to the extent possible for the situation. Providers are required to keep documentation and/or evidence of meeting this rule for each staff member that includes information on when they were trained, who completed the training, and how the employee was able to show their understanding of the information as discussed in the slide. The trainer must also have documentation in his or her file that shows that they are an expert in this subject area. The documentation can include any types of certificates or educational information that they have completed. Again, provider training standards. All providers must complete training in the following topics within 1 month of hire or certification. First one, participant choice. Second one, rights of participants, including any rights restrictions. Confidentiality. Dignity and respectful interactions with participants. Abuse, neglect, exploitation, intimidation, and all other incident reporting categories required by the division. Responding to injury, illness, and emergencies. Billing and documentation of services. Releases of information. Grievance and complaint procedures. And implementing and documenting participant objectives and progress tracking. This slide shows the topic areas that need to be trained on no later than 1 month from that hire date or initial certification date if there is a new provider. So our next slide, again, covers provider training standards. Providers must keep documentation of completed training. This may be a training summary or a competency test. The provider or one employee must be trained on the division's recertification process. Providers that have employees who deliver services like OT, which is occupational therapy, PT, which is physical therapy, nursing, must keep evidence of the employee's professional licensure or credentialing. The provider can have employees complete a summary or a test to show the understanding of the training information, but they still must keep this documentation on file for each staff member. Each provider must have one representative trained on the division's recertification process. If a provider is certified in a service that requires a license or credential, the provider must also keep documentation of that credentialing or licensure for the person delivering the service. Additional provider standards, participant-specific training. A provider must be trained on any disabilities, diagnoses, medical or risk conditions, assistive technology, equipment specific to the participant prior to the plan or modification start date. For providers with employees, a case manager may train one employee of the provider, and then the employee may train the others prior to the plan start date. Documentation of training must have the date of training, the name, title, and signature of the person who was the trainer, the name and signature of the person who was trained, and a detailed agenda of the training topics, including method of training. Providers and their staff must be trained on the participant and his or her support needs in the plan of care prior to the start or modification date. This would include any, as we indicated in the slides above, medical or risk conditions and protocols, assistive technology that must be needed to support the participant. The case manager may, again, train one person from each provider on the plan of care. The person can train the others in the provider agency prior to the plan or modification start date. The documentation for completing participant-specific training must have the following components, as we discussed earlier: date of training, trainer's name, title and signature, name and signature of the person trained, and a detailed list including the training method utilized. Section 17 talks about positive behavior supports. Providers must implement positive behavior supports as behavioral intervention prior to the use of any restrictive intervention. Participants with a challenging behavior identified by the team shall have a current functional behavioral analysis conducted within the last year. The functional analysis shall include data compiled regarding all behavior exhibited. The functional analysis should be completed by a provider staff who is knowledgeable about the participant with additional input from the team. Challenging behaviors may include actions by the participant that constitute an immediate threat to the person's health and safety, could include the health and safety of others in the environment, could also include a persistent pattern of behaviors that prevent the participant from participating in integration in the community, and finally, could include uncontrolled symptoms of physical and/or mental conditions. Moving on to positive behavior support continued. A positive behavior support plan based on the current functional behavior analysis must be developed for a participant in order for staff working with the person to understand and recognize the communication and behaviors exhibited by the person. At a minimum, a positive behavior support plan must maintain the dignity, respect, and values of the participant. Must also use a person-centered approach involving the participant as applicable. It must minimize the use of restrictive interventions. It must be specific and easily understood so direct care staff can implement it appropriately and consistently. It must be approved by verification of a signature by the participant or their legally authorized representative. The participant and their legally authorized representative must also be educated regarding the risks and benefits of any supplemental plan that includes restrictive interventions or psychoactive medications used if the plan fails. Continuing on with positive behavior supports, it must also define the antecedents and the targeted behaviors. It must list the behavioral supports that assist the participant in replacing targeted or challenging behaviors with replacement behaviors. It must provide protocols for providers and provider employees to recognize emerging targeted behaviors and determine appropriate interventions. It must provide protocols that focus on positive interventions that are least restrictive and include protocols for the use of any PRN or per required need type of medication that may be a part of the positive behavior support plan. The plan must be reviewed every 6 months by the provider and case manager. Any provider employee implementing the PBSP or provider support plan shall receive participant-specific training on the plan and on specific positive de-escalation techniques and interventions prior to working with that participant. Section 18 is geared towards restrictive intervention standards. Note, first of all, this training is not meant to provide a comprehensive guide to restrictive interventions. This section of this training is only for participants who currently have restrictive interventions approved in their plan of care. Providers using restrictive interventions must have at least one employee with completed training on positive behavior supports through any program approved by the division. Only for providers with more than 5 participants with restrictive interventions, and add an additional supervisor certified for every 10 additional participants with restrictive interventions in their plan. Providers must notify a participant's case manager within 3 business days of any use of an emergency restrictive intervention that is not written in the participant's plan of care. Provider and provider staff must have current certification in either CPI, MANT, or other entity approved by the division. More information on restrictive interventions. Provider staff trained to use restrictive interventions also must be trained in the following: the needs and behaviors of the population served, relationship building, alternatives to restrictive interventions, the difference between natural consequences and punitive consequences, avoiding power struggles, thresholds for restraint, monitoring signs of distress and obtaining medical assistance, legal issues related to restrictive interventions, positive related asphyxia, escape and evasion techniques, time limits, the process for obtaining approval for continued restraints, procedures to address problematic restrictive interventions, documentation, any participant-specific medical concerns and processes, follow-up with the staff and the participant, and investigation of any types of injuries and complaints. More information on restrictive interventions. Providers must maintain internal documentation to track and analyze the following: each use of any type of restrictive intervention, its antecedents, reasons for the use of the restrictive interventions, the participant's reaction to the restrictive intervention, and actions that may make future restrictive interventions unnecessary. Restrictive interventions continued. Other requirements for providers after implementing restrictive intervention on a participant include the following: providers must hold a debriefing meeting with the participant, legally authorized representative, and case manager after the incident to discuss the use of the restriction. Provide case managers with a copy of the provider's completed internal tracking form within 3 days. They must provide the legally authorized representative with a copy of the provider's internal tracking form within 5 days. They must submit a critical incident report to the division for each instance when a restraint is used as a restrictive intervention, and the providers must regularly collect and review all available data regarding the use of restraints and demonstrate work to reduce their duration and frequency and eliminate their occurrence. If you have additional questions on this, you can refer to the training recently posted to the website. Section 19. This covers psychoactive medication usage standards. Plan of care components regarding this. Diagnosis of medical condition. Describe medical conditions or behaviors for which this type of medication is prescribed. Include benefits and side effects. Treatment trial. Plan to monitor behavior increases, decreases, side effects, and communicate with the prescribing medical professional of if a possibility of reducing dosages or possibly discontinuing the medication. When a participant is prescribed a psychoactive medication, both the provider and the case manager should have a fairly well-rounded knowledge of the drug, what it does, and why it's being used. If a participant is being prescribed a psychoactive medication as a standard treatment, this information needs to be included in their plan of care. Additional information on psychoactive medication standards. The plan of care must regarding this. There must be a PRN protocol. It must be included in the positive behavior support plan. It must have medication changes need to be updated in the plan of care. Participant or legally authorized representative must give approval before taking the psychoactive drug. Any PRN given against the participant's will is considered a chemical restraint. Non-pharmacological interventions documented before psychoactive drug use. Provider review PRN usage monthly to determine if there is a trend or changes that need medical interventions. And then any scheduled psychoactive medication dosage missed must be reported as a medication error. The plan of care must be very detailed when using psychoactive medications. This includes information in the positive behavior support plan about the use of the drug. There must also be a protocol to train the staff on the drug and how and when to use it. Any changes made to the psychoactive medication must be documented in the plan of care. Anytime a dosage is missed of a scheduled drug, again, this must be reported as a medication error. If this is a PRN psychoactive medication, the participant or their legally authorized representative must give approval before taking that drug. If the participant is given a drug against their will, again, it's considered a chemical restraint and will be subject to review and the 8 points in the plan of care. The provider should review PRN usage and see if there is an increase or decrease in use to suggest if the participant should receive any medical intervention regarding psychoactive medication standards. We will be moving on to the next section, which is Module 5, and so we hope you can attend then. Thank you.